Hey everybody, this video is called The Reign of Amaziah, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here through the book of 2nd Chronicles, where we're going to be looking at the reign of Amaziah. And I just want to thank everyone right off for praying for us during our vacation. And so we're here in 2nd Chronicles chapter 25, verse 1 and 2, kicking this off. It says, Amaziah was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jehoaddan, however you say her name, Jehoaddan of Jerusalem. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, but not with a loyal heart. So notice that second part of verse 2. He did everything right in the sight of the Lord, but not with a loyal heart. And so we see that the reign of Amaziah here takes place between 796 and 767 BC. And you can see the parallel to this chapter back in 2 Kings chapter 14. And the king here, Amaziah, was the son of Joash, and he continued the generally godly reign that begun through his father. And Amaziah, he faithfully continued the policies of his father, yet some of the policies permitted compromises, such as the allowing of continued sacrifices and incense offerings on the high places, as seen in 2 Kings 14. And compared to the greatest human king to reign over the people of God, who I vote is David, Amaziah did not match up favorably. And we're going to see here in verse 3 and 4, now it happened as soon as the kingdom was established for him, that he executed his servants who had murdered his father the king. However, he did not execute their children, but did as it is written in the law in the book of Moses, where the Lord commanded, saying, the fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall the children be put to death for their fathers, but a person shall die for his own sin. So we see here the examples of Amaziah's obedience eliminating those that were found to be responsible for the assassination of the king, a reasonable way to change the kingdom. And this was just and in the best interests of Amaziah. And it fulfilled God's command to punish murderers that we see back in Genesis chapter 5, verse 5 through 7. Sorry, Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 through 7. And I challenge you to check out Ezekiel 18 on your own for more meaning on verse 4. And observing this limitation, which doesn't accord with the way of vengeance is taken in the nation surrounding Judah, Amaziah honors the requirements of the Lord from Deuteronomy 24, verse 16. In verse 5 through 8, it says, moreover, Amaziah gathered Judah together and set them captains of thousands and hundreds, according to their fathers' houses, throughout all Judah and Benjamin. And he numbered them from 20 years old and above. And he found them to be 300,000 choice men able to go to war, who could handle spear and shield. He also hired 100,000 mighty men of valor from Israel for 100 talents of silver. But a man of God came to him, saying, O king, do not let the army of Israel go with you, for the Lord is not with Israel, not with any of the children of Ephraim. But if you go, be gone, be strong in battle. Even so, God shall make you fall before the enemy, for God has power to help and to overthrow. So, as for these large numbers, you should check out 1 Chronicles 12:33, which I covered 1 Chronicles quite a few weeks ago now. And because of earlier losses, the numbers are lower than they had been previously. And in verse 6, the talent, and when you think of a talent, you should think approximately 75 pounds, representing here to be almost 4 tons of silver. And the wealth was paid to the king of Israel. And Jehoahaz who ordered the mercenaries of Israel to aid Amaziah against Edom. And we see in verse 7 the term man of God. And man of God is a very common term that we see across the Old Testament. It's about 70 times in the Old Testament, and it always refers to the one who speaks for God. And he warned Amaziah not to make the idolatrous Israel his ally because the Lord wasn't with Ephraim. In Israel, the capital of idolatry was the capital of idolatry pretty much at this time. And the Lord is not with Israel. It was voiced before by Abijah concerning the northern kingdom back in 2 Chronicles 13 verse 9 and 10. And in verse 8 we see that the king was very sarcastic, reminded by the man of God that he would need to be strong since God would not help. And even though it made sense for military, for Amaziah to hire and to use these troops according to the word of God, it made no spiritual sense because God was not going to supply the power to help and overthrow. And one thing we must realize is to fight with God is to receive help. But to fight against God is to have God overthrow you. So, if you're not standing with God, you're really fighting against the wind, pretty much. You're not going to win. In verse 9 says, Then Amaziah said to the man of God, But what shall we do about the 100 talents which I have given to the troops of Israel? And the man of God said, The Lord is able to give you as much more than this. So as Amaziah, he basically is asking the prophet, how much more will this obedience cost me, essentially? And that's not necessarily a bad question, because if you're going to be obedient to God and his ways, it's going to cost you something. We know that from when Jesus spoke and he said, you need to pick up your cross and follow me. That's going to be the cost of following Christ, to follow obedience. But it would not be a bad question necessarily if he had the motive of being willing to be persuaded by the Lord's answer. But the prophet, he answers wisely that the cost of obedience is always cheaper than disobedience. So if you want something to tweet, that is what you can treat or X today, whatever you want to call Twitter. The cost of obedience is always cheaper than disobedience. In verse 10 through 13 says, So Amaziah discharged the troops that had come to him from Ephraim to go back home. Therefore their anger was greatly aroused against Judah, and they returned home in great anger. Then Amaziah strengthened himself, and leading his people, he went to the valley of Salt and killed 10,000 of the people of Seir. Also the children of Judah took 10,000 alive, captive, brought them to the top of the rock, and cast them down from the top of the rock, so that they were all dashed in pieces. But as for the soldiers of the army, which Amaziah had discharged, so that they would not go with him to battle, they raided the cities of Judah from Samaria to Beth Horon, killed 3,000 in them, and took much spoil. So we see here that the man of God told Amaziah to cut his losses and to put his full trust on the Lord. And the king obeyed, and he sent the Israelite mercenaries home in anger, as they lost their chance to gain spoils. And the Valley of Salt was most likely speaking about the south end of the Dead Sea. And the south end of the Dead Sea was where David had centuries before been victorious, as seen in 1 Chronicles 18, verse 12 and 13. And Seir is really just another name for Edom. In Rock, in verse 12, it's probably a reference to Selah, the Edomite capital, which was captured in the time of 2 Kings 14:7. And this made execution it was common among pagan nations, as seen in Psalm 137 verse 9. And Amaziah, he followed the Mosaic law for holy war, seen in Deuteronomy 20 verse 13 through 18. And his obedience is rewarded with victory. In Samaria, we hear that name often through these Old Testament books. And it's a well-known town of Israel from which they launched their attacks. And Amaziah, he paid his troops as he had promised, trusting that God would be able to return to him much more, and he sent them home in faith, trusting God to protect them and to provide. And we see that the wickedness of the dismissed Israelite soldiers and their hunger for plunder and spoil. And they were determined to enrich themselves through conquest beyond their soldiers' wages. And Amaziah isn't devoted wholeheartedly to the Lord here. We see that he responds properly, though, to the prophetic warning. And details of his half-heartedness isn't recorded here like it is back in 2 Kings 14. So I do suggest that you go back to earlier this year and check out 2 Kings 14 if you didn't see that already. In verse 14 through 16, now it was so, after Amaziah came from the slaughter of the Edomites, that he brought the gods of the people of Seir, set them up to be his gods, and bowed down before them, and burned incense to them. Therefore the anger of the Lord was aroused against Amaziah, and he sent a prophet who said to him, Why have you sought the gods of the people, which could not rescue their own from your hand? So it was, as he talked with him, that the king said to him, Have we made the king's counselor cease? Why should you be killed? Then the prophet ceased and said, I know that God has determined to destroy you, because you have done this and have not heeded my advice. So notice here the details of the mercenaries and the war against Edom that are recorded here. And Amaziah did the unthinkable from a biblical and political perspective. We see that he embraced the gods of the people whom he had just defeated. And perhaps he did this because he was seduced by the wicked pleasures of idolatry, because sin will take you further than you want to go. It will cost you more than you're willing to pay. And because he thought it would help him in assuring that no future threat from Edom. However, we see that it only brought destruction to the king, who just wanted to silence the voice of God. And he disobeyed the law that's given back in Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 25 and Exodus 20 verse 3. So he disobeyed the Mosaic law in David's example in 1 Chronicles 14 verse 12 by bringing these Edomite gods into Jerusalem. And the gods of the people of Seir were unable to defend or help the Edomites, yet he worshipped them. And Amaziah, he arrogantly silenced the prophet, because that is what people do when they're not in obedience to God in the ways of God. They want to silence the messengers of God. Yet the prophet wasn't going to lighten up. He pronounced a final judgment here that was going to be used against him. Verse 17 through 20 says, Now Amaziah, king of Judah, asked advice and sent to Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, king of Israel, saying, Come, let us face one another in battle. And Joash, king of Israel, said to Amaziah, king of Judah, saying, The thistle that was in Lebanon sent to the cedar that was in Lebanon, saying, Give your daughter to my son as wife. And the wild beast that was in Lebanon passed by and trampled the thistle. Indeed, you say that you have defeated the Edomites, and your heart is lifted up to boast. Stay at home now. Why should you meddle with trouble, that you should fall, you and Judah with you? But Amaziah would not heed, for it came from God, that he might give them into the hand of their enemies, because they have sought the gods of Edom. So 17 through 20 here, from this point through the rest of the chapter, it's parallel to 2 Kings 14, once again, verses 8 through 19. And we see that Amaziah, he reacts to the Israelite raids on his territory by challenging Joash and Jehoash to fight. And Joash, we see that he responds at first with a parable in which he compares Amaziah to a thistle seeking favor from himself, just like a mighty cedar. And a wild beast is a reference here for the marauding soldiers. And Joash, he argues that Amaziah has become big-headed and that he should be content staying at home. And in verse 20, I want to check out for a second time. It says, but Amaziah would not heed, for it came from God, that he might give him into the hand of their enemies, because they sought the gods of Edom. So verse 20, we see the sovereignty of God playing out, and included the hardening of hearts of sinners, so that they no longer respond to warnings seen back, such as 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1, Exodus 3:19, Exodus 4:12, and Exodus 7 verse 3 and 4. And foolish idols led him to the foolish choices that he made. In verse 21 through 24 says, so Joash, king of Israel, went out, and he and Amaziah, king of Judah, faced one another at Beth Shemesh, which belongs to Judah. And Judah was defeated by Israel, and every man fled to his tent. Then Joash, the king of Israel, captured Amaziah, king of Judah, the son of Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, at Beth Shemesh. And he brought him to Jerusalem, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem from the gate of Ephraim to the corner gate, 400 cubits. And he took all the gold and silver, all the articles that were found in the house of God, with Obed-Edom, the treasures of the king's house, and hostages, and returned to Samaria. So Beth Shemesh is west of Bethlehem. And the defeat of Amaziah, it contrasts with his earlier victory in verses 11 through 13. And Amaziah, he lost his freedom by becoming a prisoner of the king of Israel because of the foolish attack against Israel. And Amaziah saw the defenses of Jerusalem broken down. We see that he lost the treasure of the people of God. In verse 25 through 28, to see the rest of these sad verses, says, Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, lived 15 years after the death of Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel. Now the rest of the acts of Amaziah, from first to last, indeed are they not written in the books of the kings of Judah and Israel? After the time that Amaziah turned away from following the Lord, they made a conspiracy against him in Jerusalem. And he fled to Lachish, but they sent after him to Lachish and killed him there. Then they brought him on horses and buried him with his fathers in the city of Judah. So Amaziah's folly led to plotting against him by unspecified parties. And his flight to Lachish was 30 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It was a very sufficient to please him from their hands. So to wrap up today's chapter, we see the chronicler shows the limited good of the reign of Amaziah. And we saw an example of Amaziah's obedience, and we saw the preparations for battle against Edom. And we see Amaziah's question and the answer from the prophet, and we saw Amaziah's obedience and the victory over Edom. And we see Amaziah's strange idolatry and arrogance, and we saw the king of Israel warn the king of Judah. We see that King Amaziah, who was proud, got defeated by Israel, because pride goeth before the fall. And we saw the chapter end with Amaziah killed by his own people, his own subjects. And that will wrap up for today's video. We'll see you next, as we'll be looking at the reign of Uzziah. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless.